Peter's hands trembled as he signed away his pride, a marriage contract that promised everything except love. "A ruined Marquis," society whispered, watching him wed the untouchable heiress for her fortune. Susan Crawford demanded separate bedrooms, absolute control, no romantic illusions. He agreed, desperate to save his crumbling legacy. She accepted, escaping her own gilded cage. Two wounded hearts, one cold transaction, both certain love was impossible between them. But on a storm-ravaged night, when priceless heirlooms vanished without explanation, when a devastating secret shattered every assumption, when a forbidden desire ignited where they swore never to feel anything, everything changed. Some boundaries exist to be crossed. Scotland, 1859. The correspondence arrived during a dismal February afternoon, delivering precisely the sort of catastrophe that Peter Ashworth had anticipated for months, yet persistently refused to acknowledge as inevitable. "Lord Ashworth, we must inform you that your creditors require complete settlement of Thornwood Manor's outstanding obligations within 50 days, or the estate shall be confiscated and liquidated to satisfy debts totaling $22,000. We await your immediate response. Respectfully, Morrison and Clark." Peter crumpled the parchment between his fingers, experiencing the suffocating burden of 4 centuries of distinguished lineage pressing upon his shoulders with relentless force. Beyond the windows, sleet battered against Thornwood's ancient glass panes, like accusations he could not silence or ignore. His father had decimated the family wealth through reckless speculation and catastrophic business ventures before his untimely death, abandoning him at 34 years of age, with nothing but a hollow title and a magnificent property teetering on the precipice of absolute collapse. 50 days. 7 cursed weeks to salvage everything, or witness 400 years of heritage vanish into oblivion. "My lord," Harrison's voice, his solicitor, penetrated the oppressive stillness of the oak-paneled study. The gentleman adjusted his spectacles with visible discomfort, shuffling through various documents with trembling hands. "There exists a possibility I must present, though the matter is remarkably delicate and perhaps somewhat unconventional." Peter raised his weary eyes, too exhausted for optimism, too determined to surrender completely to despair. "Speak plainly, Harrison. I've no patience remaining for careful euphemisms or gentle phrasing." Harrison cleared his throat nervously, consulting his notes with excessive attention to detail. "Miss Susan Crawford, daughter of the late industrialist Theodore Crawford. She inherited his considerable fortune when he passed 2 years past. 27 years old, unmarried, without serious suitors despite her substantial wealth. Her inheritance is quite remarkable, perhaps $65,000, possibly considerably more." Peter felt something acrid and bitter rise in his throat, tasting of shame and desperate necessity combined. "And why precisely would a wealthy young woman of independent means remain unmarried, Harrison? Surely fortune hunters circle her constantly." "She possesses a certain reputation, my lord," Harrison said carefully, selecting each word with meticulous precision. "They say she's challenging, excessively educated, far too outspoken for proper society. She's declined every marriage proposal she's received, 9 by my last count. Gentlemen find her formidable, even threatening to their sensibilities." "Formidable?" Peter almost permitted himself a bitter laugh at the absurdity. "A woman with intelligence and courage who dared possess her own convictions and express them freely. In different circumstances, under better fortune, he would have admired such qualities tremendously. In his current desperate situation, he recognized only salvation wrapped in an uncomfortable package. "Where might I encounter her?" he asked, hating every syllable that escaped his lips, detesting the mercenary calculation behind them. "There shall be a reception at the Pemberton estate within the fortnight," Harrison replied, consulting his diary. "I understand she plans to attend, though she rarely accepts such invitations anymore." Peter gazed through the rain-streaked window at Thornwood, observing the turrets his great-great-grandfather had constructed, the magnificent gardens his beloved mother had cultivated with such devotion, the legacy he had solemnly promised to preserve when his father died, begging forgiveness with his final labored breaths. 50 days to rescue everything, or lose it forever to strangers, who would never comprehend its significance. "Prepare my formal attire," he commanded, despising every word, every calculated intention behind them. "I shall court Miss Crawford with all appropriate diligence and propriety." The decision crystallized with terrible finality. Peter Ashworth, 5th Marquis of Thornwood, descendant of an ancient and distinguished lineage, would propose matrimony to a woman he had never glimpsed, pursuing money he desperately required to preserve a legacy he could not permit to perish. May God grant him forgiveness, because he would never forgive himself for this mercenary pursuit. Peter recognized Susan Crawford instantaneously when she entered the Pemberton ballroom, with quiet confidence that immediately distinguished her from every other young lady present. Not because she possessed the most striking beauty, though considerable beauty existed in the intelligent angles of her face and the keen grey eyes that observed everything with penetrating awareness, but because all the other young women drifted through the elegant space like decorative swans, while Susan Crawford walked as though she owned not merely the floor beneath her feet, but the entire establishment and everyone within it. The sapphire gown was impeccable, the neckline modest yet sophisticated, her chestnut hair arranged to reveal the determined line of her jaw and the proud carriage of her neck. She didn't smile sweetly at gentlemen who greeted her with excessive enthusiasm, didn't lower her gaze submissively, didn't feign the bashful uncertainty she clearly never experienced. And Peter realized, with something hovering between admiration and absolute despair, that courting this extraordinary woman would prove infinitely more difficult than he had foolishly imagined during his desperate planning. He observed as she conversed briefly with Lady Pemberton, responding to questions with polite precision, but without the effusive warmth other young women displayed so readily. There existed a guardedness in her demeanor, a perpetual vigilance, as though she attended the reception from obligation rather than pleasure or genuine interest. Peter waited patiently for the appropriate moment when she separated from the clustering ladies and walked toward the garden terrace to breathe fresh air. He followed her path, mentally rehearsing words that sounded hollow and manipulative even to his own conscience. How does one inform a complete stranger that he requires her fortune for survival? The frigid February wind struck his face as he stepped onto the stone terrace, sharp and unforgiving. Susan stood leaning against the carved balustrade, gazing at the lantern-illuminated gardens below, perfectly aware of his presence behind her, yet not deigning to acknowledge him with even a glance. "Miss Crawford," he began, approaching with respectful caution, maintaining proper distance as etiquette demanded. "Lord Ashworth," she replied without turning, her voice cool and measured. "You took considerably longer than I anticipated. I expected your approach during the first quadrille." Peter stopped completely, thoroughly disconcerted by her unexpected response and apparent foreknowledge. "I beg your pardon?" She finally turned, and those penetrating grey eyes examined him with uncomfortable precision and barely concealed amusement. There existed no malice in her expression, only cold, calculated assessment of his character and intentions. "Harrison has been conducting discreet inquiries about my fortune and marital status for nearly a week. He's not particularly skilled at subtlety or discretion." A slight smile touched her lips without reaching her watchful eyes. "Therefore, I presume you're here to make a proposal of marriage. Thornwood faces severe financial difficulties, doesn't it? $22,000 in accumulated debts. I've heard through reliable sources. 50 days until the estate auction commences." Peter's pride burned like molten metal poured directly onto raw wounds. She knew everything. She knew absolutely everything and had permitted him to come here anyway, probably entertaining herself with his obvious discomfort and transparent desperation. "You are extraordinarily well informed, madam," he managed, voice tight with suppressed humiliation. "I have always made it my business to be thoroughly informed," Susan replied calmly, tilting her head to study him as one might evaluate livestock at market. "It's an advantage people consistently underestimate in women, assuming we don't pay attention or cannot comprehend complex business matters." She paused, letting the implicit criticism settle between them. "When Harrison began his investigations, I instructed my own solicitor to research you comprehensively. Lord Peter Ashworth, 5th Marquis of Thornwood, 34 years old, ancient and respected title, distinguished family history, no public scandals of consequence, magnificent ancestral property, but catastrophically mismanaged for 2 generations due to your father's spectacular incompetence. Each precisely chosen word functioned as a surgical blade, methodically excising what remained of his already tattered dignity. Peter felt his hands clench into involuntary fists at his sides, knuckles whitening with suppressed fury and shame. "So, Lord Ashworth," she continued, her voice remaining soft but absolutely relentless in its honesty, "will you dance delicately around the subject with empty flattery and false courtship rituals, or do you prefer directness and complete honesty? I appreciate straightforward communication. It's remarkably rare among gentlemen of your station." Peter felt his world narrow dramatically around them, reducing everything to just himself, this remarkable woman, and the brutal truth suspended between them like an executioner's blade. Very well. If she demanded honesty, he would provide unflinching honesty. He possessed nothing left to lose except pride, and that commodity was already shredded beyond recognition or repair. "Very well. Complete honesty," he said, straightening his shoulders and meeting those challenging eyes directly. "Thornwood stands on the absolute brink of financial ruin. My father squandered our entire family fortune through gambling addiction and disastrous investments before his death. I require $22,000 within 50 days, or I shall lose everything of consequence. The property, the legacy, everything my family constructed over 4 centuries of distinguished service. I came here tonight with the specific intention of courting you and eventually requesting your hand in marriage." "Eventually," she repeated, almost amused by his transparent calculation. "As in 3 weeks hence, 2 weeks tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow, if you would accept my proposal with such unprecedented haste," Peter replied, abandoning all pretense completely. Susan gave a low laugh without genuine humor, though something resembling approval flickered in her intelligent eyes. "At least you're honest about your mercenary intentions. That's genuinely refreshing, actually. Most gentlemen would have fabricated elaborate lies, feigned sudden romantic affection, declared admiration from afar." She turned completely toward him, crossing her arms in unconscious defensive posture. "And what precisely would I gain from this arrangement, Lord Ashworth, besides the dubious honor of rescuing an impoverished nobleman from the entirely predictable consequences of his own father's spectacular ruin?" Peter swallowed the pride that threatened to completely suffocate him. "A distinguished title, elevated social position, the respectability of matrimony to ancient lineage. Thornwood is a magnificent property when properly maintained and managed. 70 rooms, 1,500 acres of prime land, strategically advantageous location near major trade routes. With appropriate investments and competent management, it could generate substantial profits again." He paused, desperately searching for something of genuine value to offer beyond hollow promises. "And I would be a faithful and respectful husband in all matters." "Faithful and respectful," she echoed, as though testing the words for sincerity and substance. "What impressive generosity you offer." The sarcasm cut deeper than any direct insult could have managed. Peter felt heat rising up his neck, spreading across his face. "Miss Crawford, if my proposal is entirely unacceptable to you—" "I didn't say it was unacceptable," she interrupted smoothly, taking a deliberate step forward. Her perfume, something expensive with subtle notes of lavender and vanilla, invaded his senses completely. "But if we're going to conduct business together, Lord Ashworth, let's do it properly with absolutely clear and honest terms from both parties involved." "Terms," Susan said, her voice steady and businesslike as though negotiating the purchase of livestock rather than discussing matrimony. "I accept your proposal of marriage." The words emerged firm, devoid of emotion, precisely as one might confirm a banking transaction or property acquisition. Peter felt relief flood through his chest, like water pouring into a desert, cooling the panic that had gripped him for weeks. Until she continued speaking, and the relief transformed into ice crystallizing in his veins. "However, there are several non-negotiable conditions that must be established and legally documented before I proceed." The relief froze completely, replaced by wary anticipation. Of course there would be conditions, A woman this intelligent would never surrender control without ironclad protections. What conditions? Peter asked carefully, bracing himself for demands he might find impossible to accept. Susan raised her chin, those grey eyes fixed on his without blinking, without retreating even fractionally. First and foremost, this will be a marriage without conjugal expectations initially. We shall share residence but maintain separate bedrooms and separate lives in that particular aspect. Peter felt the world tilt dangerously beneath his feet, his stomach dropping. But perhaps, she continued, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, one day if circumstances change, if I decide the time is appropriate, if and when I feel completely ready and safe. Until that moment arrives, you'll have no access to my person in that manner. I'm not property that comes included in this financial transaction. This condition is absolutely non-negotiable. Humiliation burned his throat like acid, searing and bitter, but Peter forced himself to nod acceptance, recognizing he possessed no leverage whatsoever for negotiation. And the second condition, he managed, voice strained. I will maintain complete control over my fortune, Susan stated firmly, each word precisely articulated. Yes, I will utilize it to rescue Thornwood from immediate catastrophe. I'll consider it an investment in our mutual future. But all subsequent financial decisions of any significance will be discussed with me and require my approval. You won't spend a single penny without my explicit consent. She crossed her arms, absolute determination evident in every line of her posture. And I will retain freedom to continue managing my investments and business interests exactly as I always have. I won't become an ornamental doll decorating your household, Lord Ashworth. I won't be silenced, ignored, dismissed or treated as mere decoration for your ancestral halls. I require your absolute commitment to respect my autonomy. Susan, the name escaped before he could contain it, too intimate for strangers who had met mere minutes ago. Miss Crawford, she corrected coldly, her expression hardening. You haven't accepted my terms yet, and there's considerably more to discuss before we reach any agreement. Peter closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself. Of course there was more. I'm listening to everything you require. Thornwood will be saved from immediate auction, certainly, Susan continued, her tone shifting slightly, becoming almost passionate about the subject. But merely rescuing it from creditors isn't remotely sufficient for long-term success. The estate needs to become genuinely self-sustaining and profitable. My father started with a small shipping company and built a commercial empire worth over $150,000 through intelligent strategy and relentless work. I learned at his side how to transform losses into profits, how to invest wisely and strategically, how to make capital work productively instead of simply spending it recklessly. Her eyes gleamed with something approaching genuine enthusiasm for the first time. I've analyzed Thornwood's public records extensively. Excellent land quality, strategically superior location near expanding rail lines, but it's been catastrophically mismanaged for years. Poor harvests due to outdated techniques, inadequate tenant relationships, criminally low rents that don't reflect market value, wasted opportunities throughout. Peter wanted desperately to argue, to defend his father's management decisions, but he couldn't because her assessment was devastatingly accurate in every detail. With appropriate capital investments and competent modern management, Susan continued, warming to her subject, Thornwood could yield $7,000 annually, perhaps considerably more. But this requires significant changes, complete modernization of operations, and someone genuinely willing to learn new methods. She stared at him directly, challenging him. I'll teach you everything I know about proper estate management, strategic investments, business administration, and financial planning. But you'll have to actually learn, Lord Ashworth, not merely nod politely and ignore my advice because it originates from a woman. You must genuinely commit to this educational process. Peter processed this information, pride and pragmatism waging fierce battle within his conscience. A woman teaching him to manage his own ancestral property, land his family had controlled for 4 centuries. His grandfather would be apoplectic with rage, but circumstances left him no alternative. But why would you do this? He asked, voice lowering. What do you truly gain besides the title? Why invest such effort in someone you don't know? Something shifted in her eyes then, ancient frustration and profound weariness breaking through the armor briefly, revealing raw vulnerability beneath. "Because I need this marriage as desperately as you do, Lord Ashworth, just for entirely different reasons than financial necessity." "I don't understand," Peter admitted honestly. Susan sighed deeply, turning toward the balustrade, gazing at the darkness beyond the lanterns. When she spoke again, bitterness saturated every carefully chosen word. "I'm 27 years old. By society's rigid standards, I should have married 5 years ago with at least 2 or 3 children by now. My family won't stop pressuring me relentlessly. Uncles, cousins, even former business associates of my late father, all insisting I need a sensible gentleman to guide my decisions properly." She laughed without any trace of humor, the sound harsh and pained. "As though my own father didn't teach me every detail of business operations before he died. As though I haven't successfully doubled his fortune in the past 2 years through intelligent, strategic investments that would shame most gentlemen." "They want control over your money," Peter said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "Precisely correct," Susan confirmed. "My uncle Richard manages portions of the business interests, the parts I still haven't been able to legally claim due to my unmarried status. He's pressuring me constantly to marry his son, my cousin Gerald, an absolute idiot who lost $4,000 on horse racing last year alone." She gripped the stone balustrade tightly, knuckles whitening. "And the only legal mechanism he possesses to force my compliance is through appointing a husband. If I continue refusing all proposals indefinitely, he can argue before the courts that I'm emotionally unstable or incapable of rational decisions for refusing so many perfectly acceptable suitors. And then a judge can appoint a legal guardian for me, almost certainly my uncle himself." Peter felt anger surge through him, not for himself or his circumstances, but for her, for the impossible trap society had constructed around intelligent, capable women. "So you need a husband," he said carefully, "but specifically one who won't attempt to control or diminish you." "Precisely," Susan confirmed, turning back to face him fully. "When Harrison started making inquiries about me, I researched everything available about you, Lord Ashworth. Educated at Oxford, respectable family background, never involved in scandals of any kind, distinguished lineage without significant stains or controversies." She stared at him directly without apologizing. "And desperate enough to accept an arrangement most gentlemen would consider completely emasculating to their pride." The word cut like a blade, but Peter couldn't deny the brutal truth it contained. "You offer me exactly what I need," Susan said, her voice softer now but no less determined or certain. "A respectable title that will satisfy my family's pressure, the legal protection of a husband that prevents my uncle from assuming control of my affairs, and a gentleman who won't try to dominate me because his own survival depends entirely on honoring our agreement." She paused significantly. "In return, you receive not just financial salvation, but genuine knowledge about how to properly manage Thornwood, how to transform it into something profitable and sustainable again. It's not charity, Lord Ashworth. It's an investment, and I always ensure substantial returns on my investments." Peter looked at her, really looked, seeing this extraordinary woman society called difficult simply because she refused to pretend to be less intelligent than she was, less capable than she had proven herself to be. She was offering not just salvation, but genuine partnership, knowledge, expertise, a real chance to truly restore Thornwood, not just temporarily save it from immediate disaster. "So we both win," he said slowly, testing the concept. "I save Thornwood and learn to manage it properly for the first time in generations. You gain freedom, legal protection, and a title that shields you from your family's control. And neither of us needs to pretend this marriage is something it's not," Susan completed, raw honesty in every word. "No romantic expectations to disappoint, no inevitable disillusionment. Just a business agreement between two people who respect each other enough to be completely honest about what they want and what they can realistically offer. It should feel cold and mercenary. It should feel horrible and wrong. But strangely, there existed something almost liberating in this brutal honesty, this complete transparency." Peter looked at her again, truly seeing not just the defensive armor and protective walls, but the loneliness hidden behind them, carefully concealed but unmistakably present. He saw a woman fighting desperately for the only thing that should be her natural right, autonomy over her own life and fortune, and he recognized that in a twisted, unexpected way they were equals, both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, both fighting for survival on whatever terms they could negotiate. "There's one final thing I need to know," Peter said quietly. "Why me specifically? There are other indebted nobles, other available titles. Why accept my proposal so readily?" Susan tilted her head, considering her response carefully. "Because I researched thoroughly, Lord Ashworth. Of the 7 nobles sufficiently indebted to accept my terms, 4 have documented reputations for domestic violence against their wives. 2 are alcoholics who spend more time in Edinburgh brothels than their own estates, and the last one," she paused meaningfully, "is already secretly married, just hiding it to secure a second fortune through fraud." Peter felt nausea rise in his throat. "You," she continued, her voice warming slightly, "have never raised your hand to anyone according to every source I consulted. You don't drink excessively, don't frequent brothels, don't gamble recklessly. Your only vices are books and horses, both relatively harmless pursuits. And most importantly, everyone I spoke with said you treat your servants with genuine respect, remarkably rare among nobility." She stared at him directly. "So yes, I would readily accept your proposal, because among all the inadequate options available, you're the least objectionable, and because I believe we can establish a civilized and mutually beneficial arrangement without destroying each other in the process. The least objectionable. It should constitute an insult, but Peter felt something strange, almost gratitude, that at least she perceived him as a decent human being, albeit a desperate one. "And if I agree to all your terms," he said carefully, "what happens next? How would this marriage actually function?" "We'll marry within 3 weeks," Susan stated matter-of-factly. "Sufficient time for proper legal formalities and detailed contract preparation." "Yes, there will be an extremely detailed, legally binding contract. We'll settle your debts immediately following the ceremony. Then we'll begin the actual work on Thornwood." Her eyes gleamed with anticipation. "I have numerous ideas. Modernization of agricultural techniques, renegotiation of all tenant leases, perhaps even small-scale manufacturing using wool from your sheep. There's tremendous wasted potential." Peter could barely process the information. 3 weeks, contract, salvation. And a wife who spoke about wool manufacturing with more genuine enthusiasm than any woman he'd known showed for balls or fashion. "So," Susan turned to him one final time, raising a defiant eyebrow, cold wind stirring the chestnut strands, escaping from her elegant hairstyle. "You need my fortune, Lord Ashworth. I need my freedom. We both obtain what we need. Do you accept these terms or not?" The wind whipped between them, carrying the lavender scent and the weight of a decision that would irrevocably change both their lives forever. Peter looked at those challenging grey eyes and saw what she didn't explicitly say, the fear hidden beneath the armor, the loneliness disguised as strength, the brilliant intelligence forced to hide itself to survive in a world that punished women for competence. He saw a woman protecting herself the only way she knew how, building insurmountable walls and negotiating impossible terms because it represented the only way to maintain some measure of control. And then he looked within himself and saw a man desperate enough to accept any terms, endure any humiliation, sacrifice any remaining pride. But he also saw for the first time in months the possibility of something beyond mere survival, the chance to genuinely learn, to become better, to honor the legacy he carried by doing something his father never accomplished, managing it with actual intelligence and care. "I accept," he said, each word costing his pride but purchasing his future. "Your terms, all of them, without reservation." Susan nodded as if expecting exactly that answer, though something resembling relief flickered briefly in her eyes. "Very well. I'll arrange everything with my solicitor tomorrow morning. The contract will be detailed and absolutely binding. Don't attempt to negotiate the terms afterward, it won't work." 3 weeks, Peter repeated, voice empty, trying to comprehend that his entire life had just changed on a cold terrace. "Unless you'd prefer to wait and lose Thornwood," she said, challenge in her voice but also something that could be understanding. "No, 3 weeks is adequate." "Excellent." She extended her hand with purely commercial formality, as if they were closing a deal on stocks. "We have an agreement, Lord Ashworth." Peter took her gloved hand, feeling the firmness of the grip. Nothing delicate or submissive existed in that touch. It was the grip of an equal, of a business partner, or perhaps of two prisoners chained together, making peace with their shared destiny. "An agreement," he confirmed, releasing her hand. Susan passed by him toward the ballroom, then paused at the door, turning one last time. The lantern light illuminated her profile, making her almost ethereal despite the hardness in her words. "One last thing, Lord Ashworth." "Yes? Don't delude yourself thinking you can convince me to change my mind about the terms. I'm not a fortress to be conquered with charm or romantic persistence." Her eyes gleamed dangerously. "I'm a woman who knows exactly what she wants and what she doesn't want. Respect that and we'll have a civilized agreement. Disrespect it and you'll discover I can make your life as miserable as any creditor ever could." She disappeared into the ballroom, leaving Peter alone on the cold terrace with the feeling he had just made a pact with someone simultaneously more dangerous and more honest than anyone he'd ever met. But at least Thornwood would be saved, and perhaps he would learn something valuable in the process, even if it cost all his pride. Peter didn't sleep that night. He remained in Thornwood's library until dawn, reviewing the contract Susan's lawyer delivered that afternoon. 26 pages of detailed terms, clauses about finances, property rights, conjugal expectations or the lack thereof. Each word carefully chosen to protect Susan and limit Peter's authority. He should feel anger, humiliation, but all he felt was profound weariness and the inevitable certainty that no other choice existed. He signed at dawn, the ink still wet when Harrison took it away. The following 3 weeks passed in bureaucratic fog. Documents, arrangements, formal announcement of the engagement that made Edinburgh society whisper with poorly disguised scandal. The Crawford heiress finally accepted someone, and precisely the impoverished Ashworth. How convenient. Peter saw Susan only 4 times before the wedding, always with chaperones, always formal, always discussing practical terms. She never smiled. Neither did he. The ceremony was small, held in Thornwood's chapel on a grey March morning. 15 witnesses, no close family from either side. Susan wore a pale green dress, simple but elegant. Peter wore his best suit that no longer fit perfectly after weeks of appetite loss. The vicar recited the traditional vows with a voice that trembled slightly, as if sensing the ice between groom and bride. "Do you take this woman?" Peter said, "I do," looking not at Susan, but at the stained glass behind her. "Do you take this man?" Susan said, "I do," with the same intonation she would use to confirm a banking transaction. The moment to sign the marriage register arrived. Peter picked up the pen, aware of Susan beside him. Their hands touched briefly when she took the pen from him. Just 1 second, lace gloves against bare skin. Electricity shot through Peter's arm. Susan felt it too, her eyes widening fractionally before quickly looking away. The first and only real touch between them. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar announced uncomfortably. Peter turned to Susan. She raised her face with carefully neutral expression. He leaned in, pressing his lips against hers for exactly 2 seconds, cold, formal, devoid of warmth or promise. When they separated, her eyes shone with something that could be relief or disappointment. Peter couldn't decipher it. "Lady Ashworth," he murmured. "Lord Ashworth," she responded, and it was done. The first night at Thornwood, Susan went directly to the Rose Room in the west corridor, the farthest from the master bedroom. Peter stayed in the library until late, drinking whiskey that didn't warm him, listening to her footsteps above finally cease. The following weeks established a painful pattern: breakfast at 8, polite conversations about weather and estate matters. Susan disappeared into the study Peter had ceded to her, diving into account books and correspondence. Dinners at 7, more polite silence, then separation to distinct rooms. Parallel lives under the same roof, shared loneliness that hurt more than true solitude. Peter was beginning to understand that he'd saved Thornwood, but lost something he didn't know he needed: human connection. And looking at Susan across the dinner table, so close physically, so infinitely distant in all other aspects, he suspected she felt exactly the same. Peter found the letters by accident. 4 weeks after the wedding, he was searching for a book on crop management in the library when papers slipped from Susan's desk. He bent to collect them and froze, seeing the childish handwriting. "Dear kind lady, thank you for the warm blankets. My brother doesn't cough at night anymore. Your friend Annie, 8 years old." Peter picked up another letter and another, dozens written in trembling hands of children learning to write, all addressed to Secret Angel or Generous Lady or simply Our Guardian. He shouldn't read them. He knew that, but he couldn't stop. "Thanks to you, I got into school. The teacher says I'm clever with mathematics. Maybe one day I'll work in a real office, not just sweeping floors. The orphanage food has improved greatly. Now we have meat 3 times weekly. Nobody knows who pays, but I know it's you. God bless you." Banking documents mixed with the letters showed the cold truth. Susan had invested more than 18,000 in the last 2 years. Orphanages in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, schools for poor girls, apprenticeship programs for young people without families. $18,000, nearly enough to save Thornwood, and she had chosen to save anonymous children instead. "You've discovered my secret," a voice said behind him. Peter turned abruptly. Susan stood in the library doorway, face pale but chin raised, defiant, even when caught. "I didn't mean to pry. The letters fell and—" Peter stopped, realizing excuses sounded hollow. "Forgive me, I shouldn't have read them." "No, you shouldn't have," Susan said, entering and closing the door. When she spoke again, weariness filled her voice. "But since you've read them, I suppose you have questions." "Why hide it?" Peter asked. Susan laughed without humor, approaching the fireplace. "Because society finds it charming when women do superficial charity. Christmas baskets, charity balls where we spend more on decorations than we donate, but investing real fortunes in education for the poor." She stared at him. "That's radical, dangerous. It shows we take these people seriously, that we believe orphan girls deserve real chances, not just crumbs of pity." Peter looked at the letters in his hands, small pieces of paper that represented changed lives. 18,000, he said softly. "Actually 21,000. There are 3 new orphanages in Inverness." "The letters don't mention them yet." She crossed her arms defensively. "Are you going to judge me for this? Say I should have saved it for emergencies?" "No," Peter said carefully, placing the letters on the table. "I'm going to say, you're not who I thought you were." Something wavered in her eyes. "And who did you think I was?" "A cold woman who saw everything as transactions and numbers," Peter admitted. He approached, maintaining respectful distance, but finally looking at her, really looking. "But these letters show someone who cares deeply, who chooses to make a real difference, even when no one knows or acknowledges it." "No one is ever just one thing, Lord Ashworth," Susan said quietly, turning toward the flames. "I can be skilled with numbers and still possess a heart. I can protect my freedom fiercely and still care about those who have no freedom at all." Peter felt remorse squeeze his chest. How many times had he judged her in recent weeks? How many times had he sat at the table thinking he'd married a woman without soul, incapable of genuine affection? "Annie is 8 years old," he said, remembering the first letter. "The age of my brother when he died of scarlet fever." Susan looked at him, surprised by the personal sharing. "I didn't know you had a brother." "Thomas. 18 years ago, but I still remember his laughter," Peter said, picking up one of the letters again. "If he'd lived, he would be terrified by our financial situation. He always cared so much about others, even as a child." Silence weighed between them, but different from the usual silence. This one had texture, weight, hesitant sharing of genuine emotion. "Why schools for girls specifically?" Peter asked carefully. Susan hesitated, then spoke. "Because no one else invests in them. Poor boys have some options: apprenticeships, manual labor. Girls, domestic service if they're fortunate, prostitution if they're not. Education could change that, could give them choices. Like the choices your father gave you," Peter said softly. My father was unusual, Susan acknowledged, old pain crossing her face. He taught me as he would teach a son. But he died, and suddenly my family decided an educated woman is an aberration, something to be corrected. That I should be silent, marry, disappear conveniently into domesticity. She hugged her arms around herself. These girls deserve better. They deserve the chances I had, but that society wants to deny them. Peter saw then not just the woman who had negotiated marriage as a transaction, but the person behind the armor. Someone wounded by loss, fighting against a world that limited her, channeling pain into purpose. "You're extraordinary," he said softly. Susan stared at him, automatic distrust evident. "Don't flatter me with empty words." "It's not flattery, it's observation," Peter insisted, gesturing to the letters. "How many people with your fortune would do this? Really do it, not just talk about doing it someday?" "I'm no saint," Susan said defensively. "I do it because I can, because—" Her voice broke slightly. "Because no one saved my mother when she needed it. She died in childbirth of my stillborn brother because the midwife was incompetent, and my father didn't have money for a proper doctor then. He made his fortune later, but too late for her." Peter felt his heart constrict painfully. "Susan, so yes, I invest in orphanages and schools because I know what it is to lose someone," she said, quickly wiping her eyes as if ashamed of the emotion. "I know what it is to feel powerless. And if I can change that for some children, even if society thinks it's radical or inappropriate, I will. I always will." Peter took a step forward, then stopped, remembering the terms. No touch, no intimacy without permission. But he wanted, for the first time since the wedding, wanted desperately to embrace her, comfort her, say he now saw who she really was beneath the protective walls. "No one ever is just what they appear, Lord Ashworth," she repeated, composing herself with visible effort. "Never just what society sees on the surface." "Peter," he said impulsively. "Pardon?" "My name. Peter, not Lord Ashworth. When we're alone," he offered something that could be peace or the beginning of something different from the cold silence of recent weeks. Susan considered, then nodded minimally. "Then call me Susan when we're private. Not Miss Crawford or Lady Ashworth." "Susan," he tested, and the name sounded different now, less formal, more real, more human. She took the letters from him, storing them carefully in her desk drawer. "Will you keep my secret?" "You don't need to worry about that," Peter assured her. "Why? You could use it against me. Spread rumors that I spend fortunes on radical charity that benefits the undeserving poor." Peter held her gaze steadily. "Because it's not a shameful secret. It's an honor. And because—" he paused, choosing words carefully, "because perhaps I'm also not just what you thought initially." "And what did I think?" Susan asked. "A useless nobleman who ruined the property and needed to be saved by a more competent woman," Peter said with a slight smile. Susan almost smiled in return. "Well, that part is essentially true." "Yes," Peter acknowledged, "but perhaps I can learn. Perhaps—" he looked around the library. "Perhaps we can be more than strangers under the same roof, more than just business partners." "I'm not changing the terms of our agreement," Susan said quickly, fear crossing her face. "I'm not asking you to change anything," Peter clarified. "Just how to explain what he barely understood himself. Friendship, perhaps. Real respect, not just the contractual obligation kind." Susan studied him for a long moment, searching for traps, finding only weary sincerity. "Perhaps," she finally agreed cautiously, "perhaps we can try that." It wasn't love, not even close, but it was a crack in the ice between them. And sometimes cracks are how everything begins to change. The dinner at the Hamilton residence 3 weeks later was an important event of the season. 35 guests, conversations about politics and business, exactly the kind of occasion Peter used to dread since the financial ruin became public knowledge. But tonight was different. Susan was beside him in a burgundy silk dress, politely conversing with Lady Hamilton about textile market trends. He noticed how other men observed her, part admiration, part discomfort, with a woman who spoke of business with such propriety and knowledge. It was during the second course that Lord Morrison, an enriched merchant with antiquated opinions, decided to share his unsolicited wisdom. "I hear Lady Ashworth manages her own finances," he commented loud enough for the entire table to hear, condescending smile on his lips. "How progressive, though I don't envy your delicate position, Ashworth. Women and numbers rarely mix well in my experience. My own wife can't even balance the household expense book without my guidance." Discreet laughter rippled around the table. Susan remained still, face carefully neutral, but Peter saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened on the fork. How many times had she heard this dismissive attitude? How many times had she been diminished, ridiculed for simply being competent? Peter felt anger burn in his chest, not for his own humiliation, but for hers. "Interesting observation, Lord Morrison," he said, voice calm but cutting through the murmured conversations. The hall silenced. "Since my wife tripled the fortune she inherited in just 2 years through strategic investments that would shame most gentlemen at this table, while I hear you lost $15,000 last quarter attempting to monopolize the grain market, unsuccessfully I might add." Morrison paled visibly. Some women hid smiles behind their fans, enjoying his discomfort. "Moreover," Peter continued, turning slightly to Susan with genuine respect in every word, "my wife possesses a sharper mind for business than any gentleman in this room, including myself, and I'm not remotely ashamed to admit it publicly." The silence was absolute now, heavy with shock. Susan stared at him, eyes wide with genuine surprise. Peter didn't stop. If he was going to do this, he'd do it completely. "In fact, I was waiting for the appropriate moment to discuss this publicly," he said, looking around the table, finding curious and some disapproving eyes. "Thornwood is being completely reorganized financially, and all investment decisions go through Lady Ashworth, not because I'm obligated by contract, but because I trust her judgment more than my own." "Ashworth," Lord Hamilton intervened, evident discomfort in his voice. "Surely you don't need to—" "I do, yes," Peter interrupted, then softened his tone. "Forgive my frankness, but I believe it's important to clarify something. There are those who think my marriage was humiliating, that marrying a woman who manages her own fortune is a sign of weakness." He took Susan's hand on the table, the first time he'd touched her intentionally since the wedding. She didn't pull away, just watched him, as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. "But the truth is, I have extraordinary fortune," Peter said, lightly squeezing those trembling fingers. "I married a woman who not only saved Thornwood from absolute ruin, but is teaching me how to manage it properly, how to make intelligent choices, how to transform a decadent property into something prosperous and sustainable again." He turned completely to her, now ignoring the other guests entirely. "So, Lady Ashworth, since we have respectable witnesses here," a small smile touched his lips, "I'd like your opinion on the investment we discussed yesterday, the new mills Lord Harrison mentioned, worth investigating." Susan blinked, processing what he was doing. He was genuinely asking her advice in front of everyone, publicly acknowledging her authority and expertise. She cleared her throat, composing herself. When she spoke again, strength filled her voice. "The mills have potential, but Harrison overestimates the return significantly. I suggest negotiating a 45% stake, not the 30% he's offering, and including an exit clause if production falls below specific levels in the first 18 months. See?" Peter looked at Lord Morrison, eyebrow raised. "Precise analysis in seconds. It took me 4 days studying the same documents, and I didn't identify those particular risks or opportunities." "Because you weren't properly trained in modern business methods," Susan said softly, then seemed surprised by her own words, as if she didn't expect to also defend him publicly. "Exactly," Peter agreed, "but I'm learning from the best possible teacher." He released her hand, aware that prolonged touch would violate their agreement, but the message was sent clearly. The dinner continued in a strange atmosphere. Some guests clearly disapproved of his public declaration. Others seemed thoughtful, reconsidering their assumptions. But Peter didn't care about their opinions, because when he risked looking at Susan again, he saw something he didn't expect in her eyes: gratitude, genuine and deep. And perhaps, just perhaps, The beginning of something that could be real respect, even affection. Not love, not yet, but another genuine crack in those impossible walls she'd built. And Peter realized it was worth every second of social discomfort, every raised eyebrow and scandalized whisper, because for the first time since the wedding, Susan looked at him as a person worth knowing, not just as a necessary transaction or obligation. Peter discovered by accident 5 weeks after the dinner. He found Susan in the study at 2 in the morning, still dressed, surrounded by letters and documents, her eyes red but dry. She didn't cry, probably never allowed herself that vulnerability. "Susan," he entered hesitantly, "is everything all right?" She raised her face, exhausted. "The Glasgow orphanage, St. Catherine's. It's going to close permanently." Peter sat in the opposite chair, waiting silently. "Accumulated debts. The building owner sold to a speculator who wants to demolish and build a factory." Her voice was controlled, but Peter heard the pain underneath. 62 children. "I have nowhere to send them. The other orphanages are full." "How much?" Peter asked directly. "6,000 to purchase the building and settle operational debts," Susan said, passing her hands over her face wearily. "I don't have it liquid now. I invested heavily in the mills we discussed. It would take 2 months to liquidate without significant losses, and they have 3 weeks. Peter saw the despair she tried to hide, the scattered letters, all from St. Catherine's. "Thank you for the hot meals. Miss Margaret taught us to read. I'm not afraid anymore because I know you care. 62 children, 3 weeks. I'm going to sleep," Susan said, rising stiffly. "Maybe in the morning I'll find a solution." But Peter saw she didn't believe that. In the following 4 days, Peter worked in absolute silence, visited discreet jewelers in Edinburgh, antique collectors, auctioneers who did private business. The great-grandmother's emerald necklace, gift from King George IV, sold for $2,100. The great-grandfather's sword collection, including a 17th century piece of $400. The Chinese porcelain dinner service, 130 pieces, $1,000. The solid silver candelabras from the Great Hall, $800. The grandfather's pocket watch, the only personal gift his father had given him, $500. Each sale hurt like tearing pieces of himself away. 300 years of family history disappearing in cold transactions. The necklace especially, his mother used to let him hold it as a child, telling stories about the great-grandmother who'd met royalty. But whenever he hesitated, he thought of those letters. "I'm not afraid anymore because I know you care." 62 children were worth more than emeralds and porcelain, worth more than his pride. He managed $6,400 in 5 days, transferred anonymously to St. Catherine's through an intermediary bank, instructing them not to reveal the source under any circumstances. He returned to Thornwood exhausted, the empty display case where the necklace had been seeming to accuse him. Susan noticed 3 weeks later. Peter was in the library when she entered, letter in hand, face pale. "St. Catherine's was saved," she said, voice strange. "Someone paid everything anonymously." Peter continued reading, forcing naturalness. "How wonderful. See, there are good people in the world." "Peter," something in the tone made him look up. Susan was holding another letter. "The jeweler mentioned casually to Harrison that you sold the necklace. He was impressed you accepted such a low price for quick sale." Silence filled the library like rising water. "And then I noticed," she continued, voice trembling now, "that the display case is empty. The candelabras disappeared. The porcelain service we used for formal dinners, replaced by a simpler one." Peter slowly closed the book. There was no point in denying. "Why?" The question came out as a broken whisper. "Why would you do this?" He stood, approaching cautiously. "Because it mattered to you." "But they were family heirlooms. 300 years of Ashworth history." Tears finally escaped. "You sold the necklace. Your father gave you that watch." "And you saved all of Thornwood," Peter said softly. "Invested a fortune in a property that wasn't yours. Why is it different?" "Because I had the money." She furiously wiped her eyes as if ashamed of the emotion. "You sacrificed pieces of your heritage, irreplaceable things." Peter took another step, stopping inches from her. "Susan, look at me." She reluctantly obeyed, those grey eyes swimming in tears. "Those objects were beautiful, valuable, full of history, he said, each word loaded with truth. But they were just things. Cold, lifeless metal and stone. He gestured to the letter about St. Catherine's. 62 children aren't things. They're lives, futures, hope. And if I have to choose between dead gold and living hope, he smiled softly, I'll always choose hope. But you barely know me, Susan whispered. Why would you care about my projects, my causes? Because you care, Peter said simply. And because... He hesitated, then decided on honesty. Because in 2 months of marriage, I've learned more about real honor from you than in 34 years watching men discourse eloquently about it. You don't just talk about doing good. You actually do it with your own resources and effort. And that's extraordinary. Susan covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Peter stood still, wanting desperately to comfort her, but remembering the terms. No touch, no intimacy without permission. But then she took the step he couldn't take. Susan threw herself into his arms, sobbing against his chest. No one ever, she gasped between sobs. No one ever sacrificed anything for me, for what I believe in. Peter carefully wrapped his arms around her, as if holding something precious and fragile. I know, he said softly. But now someone has, and I do it again without hesitation. And there in Thornwood's silent library, surrounded by old books and heavy history, something fundamentally changed between them. It wasn't love yet, but it was the moment Susan Crawford realized Peter Ashworth didn't just respect her intelligence or tolerate her independence. He saw her dreams, valued them above his own pride and heritage, considered them worth genuine sacrifice. The lawyers arrived on a warm June morning, smiling like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Lord Ashworth, the older one began, opening a leather briefcase. We've discovered something interesting about your prenuptial contract. Peter looked at Harrison, confused. Susan was traveling in Edinburgh for 4 days visiting her orphanages. The timing was no coincidence. A legal technicality, the lawyer continued, spreading documents across the desk. The clause about financial control was poorly worded. According to matrimonial property law, you have the legal right to assume total administration of Lady Ashworth's fortune. The contract can be annulled. Peter felt the air escape his lungs. Annulled completely? It would restore your traditional conjugal rights, including control over all her assets. The man pushed a document across the table. We've prepared the paperwork. Just sign here, and everything Lady Ashworth possesses legally belongs to you. Peter picked up the paper, hands trembling. $65,000, orphanages, investments, everything under his control with one signature. Naturally, the lawyer added, this also invalidates the clauses about, well, conjugal rights. You would have complete authority as a husband should. Complete authority over her money, over her body, over her life. Everything Susan had fought desperately to avoid, handed to him on a legal technicality. Peter looked at those men, respectable and competent, thinking they were doing him a tremendous favor. Who requested this investigation? He asked coldly. We took the liberty, my lord. We thought you'd like to know about your rights. My rights? Peter stood abruptly. Gentlemen, I appreciate the initiative, but no. Pardon? No, he repeated firmly. He picked up the document, feeling its weight, the weight of centuries of men controlling women through legal loopholes. I'm not going to sign this, but my lord, this would give you power. Power over my wife that she explicitly didn't want me to have, Peter interrupted. When does Susan return? Tomorrow evening, Harrison said. Excellent. I'll be waiting. The lawyers left confused. Peter remained alone with that poisonous document. Susan arrived exhausted the next evening, carrying reports. Peter waited for her in her study, document on the table, another paper beside it. Peter, she entered cautiously, noting the tension. Did something happen? Sit down, please. Susan obeyed, eyes fixed on the papers. He saw the moment she recognized the legal text. All blood drained from her face. They said, her voice failed, that you can annul it. They can, Peter confirmed. Technicality in the wording. He pushed the document to her. One signature, and I have total control over everything that's yours. Susan gripped the table, knuckles white. Peter saw raw panic in her eyes, the terror of losing everything she'd fought to protect. "So you came to inform me you're going to do this?" she said, voice dead. "No." Peter picked up the second document. "I came to show you what I'm really going to do." Slowly and deliberately he tore the annulment document, once, twice, 3 times, pieces of paper falling like snow between them. Susan just stared, mouth open, unable to process. "And more," Peter continued, picking up the other paper. "This is my new will, rewritten yesterday. If I die, everything I own passes to you without restrictions, without conditions, without male guardians or administrators. Just you, with total freedom." "Why?" The question came out broken. Peter knelt before her, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Because your freedom wasn't a bargain, Susan. It wasn't something you traded for saving Thornwood." He held her trembling hands. "It was your right. Always has been. And no legal technicality, no power society gives me will change that." Tears streamed down her face now, silent and unstoppable. "No man ever." She could barely breathe. "No man ever gave up power over me. Everyone always wanted more control." "Then everyone was a complete fool," Peter said firmly, squeezing those hands, "because what you offer freely, your intelligence, your passion, your purpose, is worth infinitely more than anything I could take by force or legal manipulation." Susan pulled her hands away, covering her face as she sobbed. Peter remained kneeling, waiting, offering presents without demanding anything. When she finally looked again, there was something different in her eyes. Not love yet, but trust, real, deep, earned through sacrifice. "Thank you," she whispered. "Always," he promised. And he knew, kneeling before her with torn paper between them, that he had just made the most important choice of his life, not to take power, but to honor the person who deserved freedom above all else. If you've made it this far in Peter and Susan's journey, I'd love to hear from you. What moment touched your heart the most? Was it Peter's sacrifice of his family heirlooms, or perhaps his choice to tear up that contract? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think happens next for this remarkable couple. And if you're enjoying this story of unexpected love and hard-won respect, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of their journey together. The storm arrived without warning on a July night, transforming the sky into a fury of lightning and thunder that shook Thornwood's ancient windows. Peter was in the library when he heard the scream, sharp and terrified. He ran through the corridors, finding Susan's bedroom door ajar. She was curled on the bed, hands over her ears, trembling violently with each thunderclap. "Susan," he entered hesitantly, never having been in her room before. Another thunder tore through the night. She curled tighter, a moan escaping her lips. Peter didn't think, just acted. He sat on the edge of the bed carefully. "May I stay with you?" She nodded, unable to speak through her fear. "Storms," he said softly, filling the silence between thunderclaps with words. "My brother Thomas was also terrified of them. I used to tell him stories to distract him from the noise." "Please," Susan whispered desperately. So Peter told stories of Thornwood, of the great-grandfather who planted the oak trees that still lined the entrance, of the grandmother who hid family jewels during a rumored French invasion that never materialized, of the eccentric uncle who insisted ghosts played chess in the North Tower every full moon. His voice filled the spaces between thunder, creating an anchor in the chaos. Gradually, Susan stopped trembling so violently. Then, hesitant, she rested her head on his shoulder. Peter froze momentarily, then relaxed, continuing the story naturally. Hours passed, the storm raged furious, then settled into persistent rain. Peter kept talking about the first time he rode alone, about the lake where he learned to swim, about every corner of Thornwood he loved. "Why are you doing this?" Susan asked in the darkness, voice hoarse. "Because you're afraid, and because I can help," Peter said simply. "You don't have to. The contract doesn't require this kindness." "It's not about the contract," Peter said, carefully shifting to make her more comfortable against him. "I came to this marriage seeking fortune, desperate to save stones and titles." He paused, feeling the truth of his next words. "But I found something I didn't know I'd lost." "What?" Susan whispered. "Purpose. Companionship. Someone who challenges me to be better than I thought I could be." Peter looked down, seeing only the top of her head. Someone who's worth more than any fortune or title. Susan didn't respond, but he felt tears moistening his shirt. "When I was 20, she finally whispered, I fell in love. Charles Whitmore. He promised marriage, said he admired my intelligence, that I was different from other women. Peter heard the beginning of something painful, until my father died and I inherited everything. Then Charles revealed plans he'd made with my uncle Richard. They'd marry, he'd assume control of the fortune, invest in schemes that would benefit them both." Her voice hardened. "When I refused, he spread rumors, said I was cold, impossible, that no man could stand me. He built the reputation that's followed me ever since." "Susan," Peter said gently. "It was on a stormy night I discovered it," she continued. "I heard him and my uncle planning in my father's study, thinking I was asleep. They were laughing about how easy I'd been to fool." She trembled. "Since then, storms remind me of that night, of how foolish I was to trust, to believe someone could love me for myself." Peter understood then, not just fear of thunder, but trauma of betrayal, of discovering that professed love was calculated deception. "Charles was a complete fool," he said firmly, "because you're worth being loved for who you are, not for what you possess or control." She raised her face, eyes shining in the dimness. "How can I know that you aren't just saying what I need to hear?" "You can't know with certainty. Not yet," Peter admitted with brutal honesty. "But I can prove it. Day after day, choice after choice, until you have no more doubts remaining." Susan studied him for a long moment, then lowered her head again on his shoulder. "Stay, just until the storm passes completely." "As long as you need," Peter promised. She fell asleep like that, curled against him, breathing finally calm and even. Peter remained completely still, holding her carefully, feeling her weight. Not just physical but emotional, the trust that had cost her so much to offer. And when the first ray of sunlight pierced the curtains, Susan woke slowly, still in his arms. Their eyes met and something passed between them, unspoken but profound. She knew in that moment that she was falling in love with Peter Ashworth. Terrifying, wonderful, inevitable. The letter arrived on an ordinary morning 2 weeks later. Cream envelope with red seal, delicate feminine handwriting. Peter opened it distracted during breakfast, then froze reading the first lines. "Dear Peter, I heard of your marriage. What a pity it couldn't be us. But if you ever need consolation from someone who truly understands you, know that I think of you fondly. Lady Margaret Sinclair." Susan was reading the newspaper on the other side of the table. She didn't see the letter, but she saw when Peter crumpled it abruptly, jaw tight. "Bad news?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Nothing important," he said, storing the paper in his pocket quickly. But in the following days, Susan noticed subtle changes. Peter, quieter, distant looks, and that damned letter she found accidentally when searching for papers in his study. She read every word, feeling something ugly and burning grow in her chest. Jealousy. Lady Margaret offering consolation. Someone who truly understands you. Susan hated herself for feeling this. They didn't have a real marriage in the traditional sense. Didn't have romantic promises beyond the contract. Peter had every right to seek comfort elsewhere. But it hurt. God, how it hurt deeply. She found him in the library that evening, the forgotten envelope on the table among account books. "Are you going to accept her invitation?" The words came out sharper than intended. Peter looked up, confused. "Who?" "Lady Margaret." "The one who offers consolation so generously," Susan said, throwing the letter on the table. "I presume you know her truly since she mentions that specifically." Understanding crossed his face, followed by something that looked like hope. "You're jealous," he said, almost wonderingly. "Don't be ridiculous," Susan said defensively, crossing her arms. "I just want to know if you plan to accept, so I can organize myself appropriately." Peter stood slowly, picking up the letter. Then, without breaking eye contact, he walked to the fireplace and threw it directly into the flames. "There is no other, Susan," he said firmly, watching the flames consume the paper. "Only you." She felt her heart race dangerously. "But Margaret said she knows you truly." Margaret was a brief suitor 5 years ago, Peter interrupted. We ended because I realized she loved my title and prospects, not me. He turned completely to her. And frankly, I haven't thought of her once since we married. Why not? Susan asked, voice barely audible. Peter approached, stopping inches away. Because every time I wake up, I think of you. About how you'll restructure that day's accounts, which orphanage you'll visit. How beautiful you look when you discuss investments with that fierce passion. Peter, Susan whispered. Let me finish, he said, breathing deeply. I know I started this for money. That I came desperate, willing to sell myself for Thornwood. And you have every right to never forget that. He paused. But somewhere between that storm and today, between learning from you and seeing you save children, between every conversation and every shared silence, his voice broke slightly. I fell in love with you completely, irrevocably. Susan felt tears burn behind her eyes. How can I know you're not saying this because you need me, because I have the money and you're still dependent? Test me, Peter said simply. Take everything, every penny. Leave me with nothing but empty Thornwood, and I'd still wake up happy beside you. He took her hands. Because you, Susan Crawford Ashworth, are worth more than any fortune, more than any legacy, more than any damn thing I thought I needed. Peter, stand up, she said, realizing he was starting to kneel. No, he said, dropping to his knees before her. You deserved someone who chose you from the beginning, someone who saw beyond the money to the extraordinary woman you are. I can't go back and be that man on that night on the terrace. Tears shone in his eyes. But I can be that man now, every day for the rest of my life if you let me. Susan also fell to her knees, framing his face between her hands. You're an idiot, she said through tears. Complete idiot for thinking I still see the desperate man on the terrace. She touched her forehead to his. I see the man who sold heirlooms to save children, who tore contracts to give me freedom, who held me during a storm without asking anything in return. Susan, he breathed. I fell in love too, Peter, she said clearly, and it terrifies me because if you hurt me, I don't know if I could survive it. I swear by everything I am, he promised fervently. I will never hurt you intentionally, never. And there, kneeling on the library floor, hands intertwined, they finally spoke the truth, not as a contract, but as a promise freely given. 6 days after that night in the library, Susan entered Peter's study carrying a sealed envelope. He stood immediately, heart racing with sudden anxiety. Her expression was serious, almost formal, reminiscent of that first night on the terrace. Peter, I need to talk about our agreement, she said quietly. I'd like to renegotiate the terms. Peter felt the world collapse beneath him. Of course, he'd declared love, exposed himself completely and vulnerably, and now she'd retreat, protecting herself as she always had, rebuilding those walls. I understand, he said, voice carefully neutral despite the pain tearing through his chest. What terms would you like to change? All of them, Susan said, pushing the envelope toward him. Open it. With trembling hands, Peter opened the envelope. Inside was a new contract, official cream paper, lawyer seals at the bottom, completely blank except for their names. He raised his eyes, thoroughly confused. I don't understand what this means. I'm annulling our original contract, Susan said, approaching slowly. I don't want legal agreements anymore, Peter. I don't want terms and clauses and protective walls between us. But you need protection, Peter protested. The law... I want a real marriage, she interrupted, her voice strengthening. I want to wake up beside you. I want to discuss Thornwood as true partners in everything. I want... Her voice broke slightly. I want to be your wife completely, in every way that matters. Peter could barely breathe, barely process what she was offering. Are you certain? You don't have to do this for me. I'm sure, Susan said firmly. For the first time in years, I'm absolutely certain about someone, about us. She smiled through gathering tears. You showed me what it means to be seen, valued, loved for who I am, not what I possess or can provide. How could I not love you too? Susan. Her name came out as prayer, adoration, promise. She pulled him down, finding his lips in a kiss that had nothing formal or restrained about it. It was hunger, promise, choice freely made. Peter wrapped his arms around her, deepening the kiss, 6 months of careful restraint finally breaking in a tide of genuine emotion. When they separated, both were trembling. "This time," Susan whispered against his lips, "when I say yes, it's forever." "Forever," Peter agreed, his heart full. That evening, after a quiet dinner where they could barely stop looking at each other, they walked slowly up the stairs together. At the top, Susan paused outside her bedroom door, then took Peter's hand. "Not there," she said softly. "Our room." She led him to the master bedroom, the room that had been his alone. Peter's hands shook slightly as he lit the candles, casting warm golden light across the space. Susan stood near the bed, suddenly uncertain despite her earlier confidence. "I'm nervous," she admitted quietly. "I've never—" "We don't have to do anything," Peter said immediately, approaching her. "Just sleeping beside each other would be enough." "I want to," Susan said, meeting his eyes. "I want this with you. I'm just afraid I won't know how to—" Peter gently cupped her face. "We'll learn together. No expectations, no pressure. Just us." He kissed her softly, tenderly. "Tell me if you want to stop at any moment." She nodded, relaxing slightly. With careful, reverent movements, Peter helped her with the buttons of her dress, his touch gentle and unhurried. Susan's breath hitched as the fabric slipped away, but Peter's eyes held only love and admiration, no judgment or demand. "You're beautiful," he whispered, and she believed him. She reached for his shirt with trembling fingers, and he stood still, letting her set the pace, letting her explore and discover in her own time. When they finally came together, it was with tenderness and care, Peter constantly watching her face, ensuring her comfort, whispering words of love and reassurance. Susan gasped at the newness of it, the intimacy she'd feared for so long transforming into something precious and connecting. They moved together slowly, learning each other, building something beautiful between them. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Susan's head on Peter's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "That was," she searched for words, "not what I expected." "Good or bad?" Peter asked, fingers gently stroking her hair. "Wonderful," she said softly. "I always thought it would be something to endure, something men demanded, but with you it felt like coming home," Peter finished. "Yes," she agreed, holding him tighter, "exactly like that." They fell asleep like that, truly together for the first time, all walls finally dissolved. 9 months later, spring brought golden sunlight to Thornwood, transforming the property into something Peter barely recognized from the dark, decadent place he'd almost lost. The fields undulated with healthy crops, the mills produced steady profit, the investment Susan had suggested proving brilliant. The debts had been settled months ago, with money remaining for improvements. And in the East Wing, newly built with honey-colored stone, the Crawford School for Girls received its second class of 30 students. Peter sat under the ancient oak in the school garden, surrounded by girls aged 7 to 13, who watched him with fascination as he read aloud. "And then the knight told the princess," he paused dramatically, making the children lean forward eagerly, "that she didn't need to be saved because she'd already saved herself through courage and intelligence." "But what about the dragon?" a red-haired girl asked. "Ah, the dragon," Peter smiled. "The princess negotiated with him. She discovered the dragon was only angry because no one had ever listened to his concerns, so they made an agreement. The dragon would protect the kingdom, and the kingdom would respect him and his needs." The girls applauded, satisfied with the ending where everyone won through communication. "That story is much better than the others," another girl declared. "The princesses don't just wait around to be rescued." "Never wait, girls," Peter said, closing the book. "The best stories are those where everyone chooses to be brave and think for themselves." "Peter," Susan's voice crossed the garden, loaded with affection and gentle exasperation. "They're waiting for you for dinner, and you promised not to be late today." He looked up, and his heart still raced after all these months. Susan stood on the school veranda, light blue dress, hair loose in the breeze, one hand resting protectively on the belly that was beginning to round beneath the fabric. 8 months pregnant, and she'd never been more radiant or beautiful. 5 minutes, he promised, turning to the girls. Tomorrow I'll finish the story of the knight who learned to bake bread. Laughter and protests, but the girls ran obediently to their arithmetic classes. Peter walked to Susan, who waited with a smile that still completely disarmed him. "You're spoiling the girls terribly," she accused without real censure. "I'm educating them," he corrected, offering his arm. "There's a difference. Telling stories about princesses who negotiate with dragons is better than waiting passively for rescue." He guided her along the stone path toward the manor. "I learned from the best negotiator I know." Thornwood rose ahead, majestic but welcoming now. Open windows letting in light and fresh air, meticulously tended gardens, servants who didn't just work but lived there with dignity and fair wages, another of Susan's successful reforms. During dinner, Peter watched his wife interact with Mrs. Brennan about the week's menu, discuss new tenant agreements with Harrison, laugh at something young Mary commented. Susan hadn't just brought fortune to Thornwood. She'd brought life, purpose, joy. Afterward, they walked through the gardens in the soft evening light, hands intertwined comfortably, at peace in silence that was no longer empty, but full of mutual understanding. "Happy?" Peter asked, as he frequently did, still needing confirmation she didn't regret her choice. Susan rested her head on his shoulder. "More than I ever dreamed possible. Even having married a desperate man who needed your money?" Peter teased gently. "Especially because of that." She stopped, turning to face him completely. Her grey eyes shone with emotion. "Because we married each other for the wrong reasons, Peter. But we stayed for the only right reasons. Daily choice, earned respect, love that grew not despite our scars and wounds, but through them." She touched his face tenderly. "And because every day you choose me and I choose you. Always." Peter held her hand against his face, turning to kiss the palm. "You know what I realized." "What?" Susan asked. "That I came to this marriage thinking I needed to save Thornwood. That this was my purpose, my entire reason for existing." He pulled her closer, careful with the growing belly between them. "But you taught me that legacies aren't made of stones and titles. They're made of choices, of how we treat people, of what world we leave behind for the next generation." Susan smiled, tears shining. "You're getting philosophical, Lord Ashworth." "Your fault entirely, Lady Ashworth. You made me think and feel." He looked around at the school they'd built together, at restored Thornwood, at the prosperous fields. "All of this is ours. Not mine, not yours. Ours, together. Ours," she agreed softly, emotion thick in her voice. Peter slowly lowered himself, kneeling on the soft grass despite her protest. Susan gasped when he placed both hands on her belly, looking up with reverence that made her tremble. "And soon," he murmured, speaking to both her and the life growing under his hands, "we'll be 3. "She'll love you," Susan said, voice thick, running her fingers through his hair. "Or he will grow up knowing a father who respects women, who values intelligence, who knows real fortune isn't stored in vaults but created through kindness. And will know a mother who changes the world," Peter added, pressing a gentle kiss to her belly. "Who saves children, who's braver than any knight in stories." He felt movement under his hands, a small kick, life responding. "Did you feel that?" Susan laughed, wonder and joy mixed. "I felt it." Peter stood, pulling her into a careful embrace, wrapping her completely in his arms. "Our child, our new beginning." They remained like that as the sun descended, painting Thornwood in shades of gold and pink. 2 hearts that began with cold transaction but found true warmth. "This time," Peter whispered against her hair, "when I said yes, it was forever." "Forever," Susan agreed, holding him tighter. The complications began in Susan's 9th month. Doctor Matthews visited weekly now, his expression growing more concerned with each examination. "The baby is positioned awkwardly," he said carefully one October morning, Susan resting in bed. "Not ideal for delivery. We'll need to monitor this very closely." Peter felt his blood run cold. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," the doctor chose his words carefully, "that delivery may be difficult, possibly dangerous for both mother and child." Susan's hand tightened on Peter's. "What are our options?" "We wait and hope the baby turns naturally," Dr. Matthews said, "or we may need to intervene during labor itself. I won't lie to you, Lady Ashworth. This could become serious." After the doctor left, Peter sat on the edge of the bed, holding Susan's hand. "We'll get through this," he said, trying to sound confident. "You don't know that," Susan said quietly. "My mother died in childbirth. What if—" "Don't," Peter interrupted, pressing her hand to his lips. "Don't go there. You're strong, you have the best medical care, and I'll be right here with you through everything." "They won't let you in the room," Susan said. "It's not done." "Then I'll break down the door if necessary," Peter said firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone, never." The labor began 3 weeks later, in the middle of a November night. Susan woke Peter with a gasp, gripping her belly. "It's time," she managed. The household erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Matthews arrived within the hour, bringing a midwife and his assistant. They took over the bedroom, and a servant physically blocked Peter from entering. "My lord, you cannot be present," the midwife said firmly. "It's not proper." "I don't care about proper," Peter said, trying to push past. "That's my wife in there." "Sir, you'll only be in the way," Dr. Matthews said, appearing in the doorway. "Let us work. I promise to update you regularly." Peter paced the hallway for hours, listening to Susan's labored breathing, her occasional cries of pain. Each sound tore through him like a blade. Harrison tried to get him to rest, to eat, but Peter refused to move from outside that door. 6 hours became 8, then 10. Dr. Matthews emerged once, face grave. "It's not progressing as it should. The baby is still positioned wrong, and Lady Ashworth is weakening." "What can you do?" Peter demanded. "I may need to turn the baby manually." "It's risky, painful for her, but it may be the only option." The doctor hesitated. "There's a chance we may have to choose, my lord, between saving your wife or saving the child." Peter felt the world stop. "What?" "In the worst scenario, if complications continue, we may reach a point where we can save one but not both," Dr. Matthews said quietly. "I need your decision now, before we reach that crisis. Who do I prioritize?" Peter didn't hesitate even a second. "Susan. Always Susan." "Save my wife." The doctor nodded approvingly. "I was hoping you'd say that. Many men would choose differently, wanting the heir." "I don't care about an heir," Peter said fiercely. "I care about Susan. She's irreplaceable. Do whatever you must to save her." Dr. Matthews returned to the room, and Peter resumed his pacing, praying more desperately than he ever had. 2 more hours passed. Then suddenly, a different sound. A baby's cry, thin and wavering, but definitely alive. Peter froze, heart pounding. The door opened and the midwife emerged, smiling. "Congratulations, my lord, you have a daughter." "And Susan?" Peter demanded, not caring about anything else. "Exhausted but alive and well. Dr. Matthews will explain, but she came through beautifully." Peter nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see her?" "Give us a few minutes to clean up, then yes." Those few minutes felt like hours. Finally, Dr. Matthews emerged, looking exhausted himself. "You can go in now." But brief visit, she needs rest. Peter practically ran into the room. Susan lay in the bed, pale and exhausted, but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in white linen. "Peter," she said softly, "come meet your daughter." He approached slowly, reverently. The baby was impossibly small, with a cap of dark hair and tiny fingers that gripped Susan's thumb. "She's perfect," he whispered, sitting carefully on the bed. "You're perfect. You're both perfect." "Doctor, Matthews said you chose me," Susan said quietly. "If it came to it, you told him to save me, not the baby." Peter met her eyes. "Without hesitation, I would make that choice 1,000 times. Even though she's your heir, your legacy." "You are my legacy, Susan," Peter said firmly. "You and whatever time we have together. This little one is a blessing, but you are irreplaceable. I would never choose differently." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Peter said, carefully embracing both of them. "More than I ever thought possible." The baby stirred, making small sounds. What should we name her? Susan asked. Peter considered. What about Catherine? After my brother Thomas's middle name was Catherine in honor of our grandmother. Catherine Ashworth, Susan tested. I like it. Catherine Margaret, perhaps? Margaret was my mother's name. Perfect, Peter agreed. Catherine Margaret Ashworth. He looked down at his daughter, at his wife, at everything he'd almost lost today. Our Catherine. The following weeks were exhausting but joyful. Catherine was a good baby, crying only when hungry or uncomfortable. Susan recovered steadily, though Dr. Matthews ordered complete rest for a month. Peter managed both the household and estate matters, bringing Catherine to Susan for feedings, often staying to watch them together. One night he found Susan crying quietly while holding the sleeping baby. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Are you in pain?" "No," Susan said, wiping her eyes. "I'm just thinking about my mother. She died doing this, giving life, and I survived. I have everything she never got to experience. A child, a husband who loves me, a life ahead." She looked at him. "It feels like both a gift and a grief." Peter held her carefully, mindful of her still healing body. "Your mother would be proud of you, of everything you've built, everything you've become." "I wish she could have met you," Susan said. "Met Catherine." "So do I," Peter agreed. "But in a way, she's here, in your strength, in your compassion. You carry her forward." They sat together in the candlelight, their daughter between them, a family forged through struggle and choice. 2 months after Catherine's birth, on a cold January morning, Peter found Susan in her study, papers spread before her. "What's this?" he asked. She looked up, smiling mysteriously. "New plans. The Crawford School is doing so well, I want to open 2 more, one in Glasgow, one in Aberdeen." "That's ambitious," Peter said, sitting across from her. "How much would it cost?" "About $12,000 initially," Susan said, "but I've done the calculations. If we invest now, within 5 years they'll be self-sustaining, training girls in useful trades, placing them in good positions." She paused. "What do you think?" Peter considered. A year ago he would have been horrified at spending such a sum. Now he understood her vision. "I think," he said slowly, "that we should do it. These girls deserve the same chances Catherine will have." Susan's face lit up. "Really? You're not worried about the expense?" "I'm worried about what kind of world Catherine grows up in," Peter said. "If we can make it better for even a few dozen girls, that's worth more than keeping money idle in banks." He stood, walking around the desk to kiss her. "Besides, you've never been wrong about investments yet." "There's something else," Susan said, pulling out another document. "I've been thinking about the estate. What if we converted part of the land to tenant ownership? Let them buy their plots over time, give them real stake in the success." Peter was stunned. "That's radical, practically revolutionary." "It's smart," Susan corrected. "Owners work harder than renters. They'll improve the land, increase yields. Everyone benefits." She looked at him challengingly. "Are you brave enough?" Peter laughed. "With you? Always. Let's do it." He pulled her close. "Let's change everything." And there, in Susan's study with baby Catherine sleeping peacefully in the corner cradle, they planned their future, not just for themselves, but for the world they wanted their daughter to inherit. A world where intelligence mattered more than gender, where opportunity wasn't limited by birth, where 2 people who started as strangers could build something extraordinary together. "I never imagined this," Susan said softly, leaning against Peter. "When I was negotiating those terms on the terrace, arguing about control and freedom, did you ever think we'd end up here?" "Honestly, no," Peter admitted. "I thought I was trading my pride for survival. I never imagined I'd gain everything that actually matters." "And what matters?" Susan asked. "This," Peter said simply, gesturing to encompass everything. Their daughter, their partnership, their shared purpose. You, us, the life we're building together, that's the only legacy that matters." Susan turned in his arms, kissing him deeply. "Then we're the richest people in Scotland." "Richer than I ever dared dream," Peter agreed. Catherine was 6 months old when the letter arrived from London. Peter opened it during breakfast, then set it down with a strange expression. "What is it?" Susan asked, bouncing Catherine on her lap. An offer, Peter said slowly. From the Duke of Somerset. He wants to purchase Thornwood. Susan froze. What? Why would he want to buy it? He's consolidating estates in Scotland, Peter explained, picking up the letter again. He's offering $85,000. More than enough to settle everything. Live comfortably anywhere we choose. He looked at her. It's a generous offer, Susan. Extraordinarily generous. Susan's mind raced. $85,000 would give them complete freedom. They could live in Edinburgh or even London. No more worrying about harvests or tenants, just pure financial security. What do you want to do? She asked carefully. Peter was quiet for a long moment. A year ago, I would have been horrified at the thought of selling. Thornwood is 400 years of family history. My ancestors built this place. He paused. But now I'm not sure what I feel. Tell me honestly, Susan said. What does Thornwood mean to you now? Peter walked to the window, looking out at the estate. It means something different than it did. When my father died, I thought preserving Thornwood was my only purpose, that without it I was nothing. He turned back to her. But you taught me that legacy isn't about buildings or land. It's about what we do, how we live, what we give to the world. Oh, so you want to sell? Susan asked, surprised. I don't know, Peter admitted. Part of me thinks we could do more good with that money. More schools, more opportunities for people who need them. Another part of me thinks about Catherine growing up here, learning to ride in these fields like I did. Susan stood, carrying Catherine to him. This is your decision, Peter. It's your family home. It's our home, Peter corrected. Everything we have is ours together. I won't make this choice without you. They stood together, looking out at Thornwood's grounds. Let's think about it, Susan suggested. We don't have to decide immediately. Peter nodded, but Susan could see the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Over the following week, Peter walked the estate endlessly, visiting every corner. He spoke with the tenants, toured the mills, sat in the family chapel. Susan watched him wrestle with the choice, not interfering but offering support. One evening, she found him in the library surrounded by old family journals. Finding answers? She asked gently. Finding perspective, Peter said. I've been reading my great-grandfather's journals. He wrote about the responsibility of stewardship, about how each generation must decide what to preserve and what to change. He showed her a passage. He wrote, "A legacy bound in stone alone is a tomb, not a home. True legacy lives in the hearts we touch, the lives we improve, the world we leave better than we found it." Susan read the words, moved by their wisdom. He sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was, Peter agreed. And he would tell me that Thornwood is just a place. What matters is what we do with our time, our resources, our lives. He closed the journal. I think I know what I want to do. Tell me, Susan said, sitting beside him. I want to keep Thornwood, Peter said. Not because of pride or tradition, but because we can use it for good. The schools, the tenant ownership program, everything we're building, we can do more from here than we could anywhere else. He took her hand. But I want to do it right. I want to establish a trust, legally binding, that ensures Thornwood will always serve a purpose beyond our family. That ensures the schools continue, that the tenant programs expand, that this place becomes something truly meaningful. Susan felt tears prick her eyes. You want to turn your inheritance into something that serves others. I want to turn our inheritance into something Catherine can be proud of, Peter said. Not just because it's old or grand, but because it makes a real difference. He squeezed her hand. What do you think? Am I being foolish to turn down $85,000? I think, Susan said, her voice thick with emotion, that I've never loved you more than I do right now. And I think your great-grandfather would be incredibly proud. Peter wrote to the Duke of Somerset that evening, politely declining the offer. Then he and Susan began working with solicitors to establish the Thornwood Trust, a legal entity that would ensure the estate's resources served educational and charitable purposes in perpetuity. The work was complex, taking months to finalize, but by Catherine's first birthday, the trust was established. Half of Thornwood's annual income would fund the schools and charitable programs. The tenant ownership program was formalized. and provisions were made to ensure future generations couldn't simply dissolve the trust for personal gain. "It's done," Peter said, signing the final documents. "Thornwood no longer belongs just to us. It belongs to its purpose." Susan signed beside him, making it official. "I think this is the most important thing we've ever done." They celebrated quietly that evening, just the two of them after Catherine was asleep. "Do you have any regrets?" Susan asked as they sat before the fire. "About turning down all that money?" "None," Peter said without hesitation. "Money is just a tool. We're using ours to build something that will outlast us." He pulled her close. "Besides, I already have everything I need. You, Catherine, purpose, partnership. What more could I possibly want?" "Nothing," Susan agreed, kissing him softly. "We have everything that matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, Thornwood stood solid against the night sky, no longer just an ancestral estate, but a living legacy of choice, compassion, and change. The following morning, Peter woke to find Susan already up, working in her study despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, bringing her tea. "Too excited," she admitted, smiling up at him. "I've been calculating how many more girls we can help now that the trust is established. Peter, with the guaranteed funding, we could expand to 5 schools within 3 years, maybe 7 within 5. Her eyes glowed with passion. "Imagine hundreds of girls getting real education, real opportunities." Peter set down the tea and pulled her to her feet. "You're brilliant, you know that?" "I'm practical," Susan corrected. "There's a difference." "You're both," Peter said, kissing her forehead. "And I'm grateful every day that you agreed to that ridiculous arrangement on the terrace, even if it was just because I was the least objectionable option." Susan laughed. "You'll never let me forget I said that, will you?" "Never," Peter confirmed, grinning. "It's my favorite insult anyone's ever given me." They heard Catherine crying from upstairs, demanding attention. "I'll get her," Peter said, but Susan caught his arm. "Wait, before we start the day, I need to tell you something." Her expression turned serious. "What is it?" Peter asked, concerned. Susan took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I'm pregnant again." Peter's eyes widened. "Are you certain?" "Very certain. About 3 months along, I think." She watched his face anxiously. "I know it's soon after Catherine, and with everything we're doing with the trust and the schools." Peter cut her off by sweeping her into his arms, spinning her carefully. "It's perfect. You're perfect. Everything is perfect." He set her down gently. "Are you happy about it?" "Terrified," Susan admitted, "but yes, incredibly happy, though Dr. Matthews will probably scold me for not waiting longer between pregnancies." "We'll make sure you have the best care," Peter promised, "and I'll be there every step of the way, door-breaking threats included." Susan laughed, then grew serious again. "Peter, I want you to know something. If complications happen again, if there's a choice—" "There won't be," Peter interrupted firmly. "Don't even think about it." "But if there is," Susan persisted, "I want you to choose the baby this time. Catherine needs a sibling, and you—" "No," Peter said absolutely. "I will always choose you, Susan, always." "I already told you that." He cupped her face in his hands. "You are irreplaceable. Any child would be blessed to have you as a mother, and I will never, ever choose differently. Do you understand?" Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand, and I love you beyond measure." Catherine's cries grew more insistent upstairs. "Come on," Peter said, taking Susan's hand. "Let's go tell our daughter she's going to be a big sister." They climbed the stairs together, hand in hand, toward their crying daughter and their expanding future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as they had faced everything else, with love, partnership, and unwavering commitment to each other and the legacy they were building together. Susan's second pregnancy progressed smoothly, Dr. Matthews monitoring her closely after the complications with Catherine. By her 7th month, he declared both mother and baby healthy and thriving. "Whatever you're doing differently this time, keep doing it," he told them during a routine visit. Peter knew what was different. Susan wasn't carrying the weight of fear and uncertainty she'd borne with Catherine. She was surrounded by love, support, and absolute security in their partnership. Their son was born on a mild April morning, arriving quickly and without complications. Peter was present despite the midwife's protests, holding Susan's hand throughout. When the baby's first cry filled the room, Susan laughed through tears of relief and joy. "A boy," Dr. Matthews announced, cleaning the infant. "Healthy lungs, strong grip. Congratulations." Peter cut the cord himself, hands shaking with emotion. When the baby was cleaned and wrapped, he placed him in Susan's arms. "He's perfect," she whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. "Absolutely perfect." Catherine, now almost 2 years old, was brought in to meet her brother. She peered suspiciously at the small bundle. "Baby?" she asked uncertainly. "Yes, your baby brother," Susan said. "You're a big sister now." Catherine reached out carefully to touch the baby's hand. When his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, she gasped with delight. "Mine!" she declared possessively. Peter laughed. "Yes. He's yours to help protect and care for." "What shall we name him?" Susan asked. Peter considered. "What about Thomas?" "After my brother." "Thomas Theodore for your father." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Theodore Ashworth, it's perfect, absolutely perfect." She looked down at their son. "Welcome to the world, Thomas. You have a lot to live up to, with a sister like Catherine and grandparents like yours." The weeks following Thomas's birth were chaotic but joyful. Catherine took her role as big sister very seriously, bringing Thomas her favorite toys and patting his head gently. Susan recovered quickly, though Peter insisted she rest as much as possible. "I'm fine," she protested when he tried to take over her work in the study. "Dr. Matthews said I'm healing beautifully, and I want to keep it that way," Peter said firmly. "The schools and trust can wait a few more weeks. You need to rest." "You're insufferably protective," Susan complained, but she was smiling. "Always," Peter confirmed, kissing her forehead. "Get used to it." 3 months after Thomas's birth, representatives from the University of Edinburgh approached them with an unexpected proposal. "We'd like to establish a scholarship program," Professor McGregor explained in their drawing room. "Specifically for young women pursuing higher education. We were hoping you might consider funding it." Peter looked at Susan, seeing her eyes light up. "How many scholarships?" she asked. "We were thinking 10 initially," the professor said. "But we could expand if funding allows." 20, Susan said immediately. "We'll fund 20 scholarships annually, full tuition, books, living expenses, everything they need to succeed." Professor McGregor looked stunned. "That's extraordinarily generous, Lady Ashworth, are you certain?" "Absolutely certain," Susan confirmed. "With one condition, the selection process must be merit-based only. No consideration of family background or connections, pure academic potential." "Of course," the professor agreed eagerly. "We wouldn't have it any other way." After he left, Peter pulled Susan into his arms. 20 scholarships? That's a significant commitment." "We can afford it," Susan said. "And think about what it means, Peter. 20 young women every year getting the education they deserve. Over time, that's hundreds of women entering professions, changing society." "You're going to change the world," Peter said, amazed. "We're going to change the world," Susan corrected. "Together." The Crawford Ashworth Scholarships, as they became known, were announced that fall. Applications poured in from across Scotland, far more than they anticipated. Susan personally reviewed every application, determined to select the most deserving candidates. "This one," she said excitedly one evening, showing Peter an application. "Her essay is extraordinary. She wants to study medicine, become a physician." "A female physician," Peter said, surprised. "That's almost unheard of." "Exactly why she deserves support," Susan said. "She'll face enormous obstacles, but imagine if she succeeds. She could save lives, inspire other women." Peter read the essay, moved by the applicant's passion and determination. Fund her. Fund all of them who show this kind of promise. By Catherine's 3rd birthday, their lives had settled into a joyful rhythm. The estate thrived under the trust's management. The schools were educating over 100 girls across Scotland. The scholarship program was sending its first cohort to university. And at Thornwood, The Ashworth family grew and flourished. One evening, after putting both children to bed, Peter found Susan on the terrace where they'd first negotiated their arrangement. She stood at the same balustrade, looking at the gardens illuminated by lanterns. "Remembering that night?" he asked, joining her. "Hard not to," Susan said. "Standing here, negotiating terms, so certain I needed to protect myself from you." She laughed softly. "I was terrified you'd try to control me, diminish me. And instead," Peter prompted, "instead you gave me freedom I never asked for, love I didn't think existed, partnership beyond anything I imagined possible." She turned to face him. "I came to that negotiation thinking I was so clever, protecting myself with contracts and conditions. But you taught me something I didn't understand then." "What's that?" "That real protection doesn't come from legal documents," Susan said. "It comes from trust, from someone who chooses every single day to honor you, value you, love you completely." Peter pulled her close. "I should thank you for giving the desperate, impoverished Marquis a chance." "The ruined Marquis," Susan corrected with a smile. "That's what they called you, remember? The ruined Marquis of Thornwood." "They were right," Peter said. "I was ruined. Financially, emotionally, spiritually. I had nothing left but empty pride and a crumbling estate." He touched her face tenderly. "But you saved me, Susan. Not just Thornwood, but me. You showed me what real wealth looks like, what legacy truly means." "We saved each other," Susan insisted. "I was just as lost as you were, just in different ways. Trapped by money instead of lack of it, isolated by intelligence that society wanted to punish rather than celebrate." They stood together in the spot where everything had begun, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd chosen differently that night?" Peter asked. "If you'd refused my proposal, found someone else?" "Never," Susan said firmly, "because even then some part of me recognized you, saw past the desperation to the decent man underneath. I wouldn't change a single thing. Not even the difficult parts, the arguments, the fear, the uncertainty. Especially not those parts," Susan said. "They made us who we are. They taught us how to trust, how to love, how to build something real instead of just something convenient." Peter kissed her softly, tasting joy and certainty. "I love you, Susan Crawford Ashworth. More than words can possibly express." "I love you too," Susan whispered against his lips. "My ruined Marquis, who turned out to be the richest man I ever met, in all the ways that truly matter." They returned inside together, checking on their sleeping children one last time before retiring to their shared bedroom. As Peter held Susan in his arms that night, he marveled at the journey that had brought them here, from desperate strangers negotiating a cold transaction to partners in every sense, building a life filled with purpose, love, and genuine meaning. 5 years later, summer sunlight flooded Thornwood's Great Hall, where nearly 200 guests gathered for the 5th anniversary celebration of the Crawford Ashworth Trust. Catherine, now 7, stood proudly beside her mother, wearing a blue dress and helping to greet visitors. Thomas, 5 years old, raced around with other children, his laughter echoing through the halls. Peter stood with Susan, watching representatives from all 7 Crawford schools present their progress reports. Over 300 girls were now receiving education. 15 scholarship recipients had graduated university, entering professions from medicine to law to business. "Lady Ashworth," one young woman approached shyly, "I wanted to thank you personally. I'm Margaret Ross. I received a scholarship 3 years ago. I just completed my medical degree." Susan's face lit up. "Dr. Ross now. I remember your application. You wanted to bring medical care to rural communities." "I'm opening a practice in the Highlands next month," Margaret confirmed. "Serving villages that have never had a physician. None of this would be possible without your support." After Margaret left, Peter squeezed Susan's hand. "You did that. You changed that young woman's entire life." "We did that," Susan corrected. "This is our legacy, Peter. Not Thornwood's stones, but lives changed, opportunities created, a world made better." Their younger daughter, 2-year-old Eleanor, toddled over demanding to be picked up. Peter swept her into his arms, making her giggle. "Are you happy, Papa?" Catherine asked, ever perceptive. Peter looked around at the celebration, at the evidence of lives changed and futures brightened. He looked at his brilliant wife who had transformed from a guarded stranger into his best friend and greatest love. He looked at his 3 healthy children, growing up in a world they were actively making better. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," he told Catherine honestly. "When I married your mother, I thought I was saving a building. Instead, I found everything worth living for." Susan overheard, her eyes glistening. "Still charming me with words, Lord Ashworth?" "Always, Lady Ashworth," Peter confirmed. "Forever." That evening, after the guests departed and the children were asleep, Peter and Susan returned once more to their terrace, the same spot where everything began, where 2 desperate strangers had negotiated terms neither fully understood. "5 years of the trust," Susan said. "Can you believe it?" "I can believe anything now," Peter said. "You've taught me that impossible things become possible when 2 people commit completely to each other and to something larger than themselves." He pulled her close. "Thank you for accepting the proposal of a ruined Marquis who had nothing to offer but empty titles and desperate need." "Thank you for seeing past my walls to the woman underneath," Susan countered, "for giving me freedom, respect, partnership and love I never dared hope existed." "So we both won," Peter said, echoing words from that first negotiation. "We both won everything that truly matters," Susan agreed. They stood together as stars emerged, 2 hearts that had found each other in desperation, but built something extraordinary through daily choice, mutual respect, and unwavering love. The ruined Marquis was ruined no longer, and the indomitable young heiress had found what money could never buy, a partner who valued her not for her fortune, but for her brilliant, compassionate, extraordinary self. And in the end, that proved to be the greatest wealth of all. Thank you so much for joining Peter and Susan on their journey from cold transaction to deep abiding love. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful relationships begin in the most unexpected ways, and that real partnership is built not on perfect circumstances, but on daily choices to honor, respect, and cherish each other. If this story touched your heart, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories of unexpected love, hard-won trust, and relationships that transform everything waiting for you here. And please, share in the comments. What moment in Peter and Susan's story resonated most with you? Was there a particular scene that made you believe in their love? Have you experienced a relationship that started one way but became something completely different and beautiful? Thank you for being part of this community. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share the next story with you. Until then, remember, the best legacies aren't built in stone, but in the lives we touch and the love we give freely. See you in the next story.